So with that, I want to go into basically the primary focus of our program today, and that is the recent NAR, that's National Association of Realtors settlement. So I want to cover a little bit what it means for both buyers and sellers. I had the opportunity actually yesterday to attend a town hall meeting with the attorney who is the counsel for the our local here, Greater Palm Springs Realtors Association. So he conducted a town hall meeting with the association members to go into great detail about the settlement and what it means for buyers and sellers. So I want to get into the details on that a little bit. And as you probably have heard, the whole idea with this settlement is to change how real estate commissions are being paid. And it's really more about how they're going to be paid and negotiated, not so much the focus on how much is going to be paid. That's, as you're going to find here as in my comments, that's really going to kind of squirt out over time as these changes are made. Understand first that the goal of this legal action and the settlement is to provide more price transparency and more competition. And by price transparency, what we're talking about is more transparency as it relates to real estate commissions. And the expectation is by making real estate commissions more transparent to all parties, in particular to buyers, then that may create more competition, which is deemed generally to be healthy and should help maybe over time to reduce the cost to both buyer and seller as it relates to real estate commissions. Now, the rule changes involved are expected to be implemented by mid-July of this year. So they're not implemented yet, but they're expected to by mid-July of this year. So keep that in mind. And in the interim, what's going to be happening is a lot of the real estate forms, the contract forms that are used on real estate transactions, there's going to be some revisions to some of those. There may be some new ones, all related to this settlement. So it's basically that period of time between now and mid-July when that work is already underway. And so that by that implementation date, all the disclosures that would be involved will be updated and more in compliance with these the new rules as a result of the settlement. One of the most important things about this settlement is to basically create a situation where buyers agents will no longer be marketing their services for quote unquote for free. Now, what the heck does that really mean? Is that really what's been going on? Well, keep in mind the historical context of real estate commissions. For the past 60, 70 years, what's been happening is when a real estate agent negotiates a listing with a seller, part of that listing agreement will be a negotiation with the seller by the listing agent to determine what is the commission amount the seller is willing to pay. And, historically, a number of 6% became sort of the golden or the going rate, if you will. That was really not set by any policy decision or rule implementation. That just became sort of a customary number that's continued for literally decades. In more recent years, we've seen that get compressed a little bit. I've seen a lot of transactions where the total commission that the listing agent's negotiating with the seller is 5%. And then what happens in those negotiations in that listing agreement, it will also involve what percentage of that total commission the seller is authorizing the listing agent to offer to buyer's agents. And usually it would be a split 50-50. So if it was a 6% commission negotiated in the listing agreement, 3% would be offered to the buyer's agent, 3% would go to the listing agent. Or if it was 5, then 2.5 and 2.5. So, and then what would happen is if a buyer approached a real estate agent to represent them as a buyer's agent, the general practice has been that agent will start showing them property and ultimately, get them pre-qualified by somebody else, but like us, and submit an offer. And the buyer's agent would be aware of what they're getting paid, not because they entered into a written agreement with the buyer, but because they looked at the listing. In the listing itself, there would be a section that would indicate what commission amount, either dollar amount or percentage amount, is being offered to the buyer's agent by the seller. So that's what's been happening up until now. But the odd outcome was it meant as a real estate agent, you could start working with a buyer, help them look for homes, represent them, submit an offer, without having any sort of written agreement with the buyer. And that was identified as really sort of an odd outcome that needed to be addressed. And because without that, that gave the buyer agent the ability to give the buyer impression that they were going to be providing their services to the buyer for free, because the buyer wasn't paying it. It was going to come out of the seller proceeds. So that's an important point to make. That's no longer going to be part of the the landscape, if you will, for real estate commissions going forward. Even more important part of this settlement is going to be the use of buyer broker agreements that are going to be required before touring. Now, buyer broker agreement, actually, that's a disclosure, a form that's been around for a while, but it was rarely used because you didn't have to. That's going to be changing. A buyer broker agreement is now basically going to be recommended, if not just required. In fact, it is going to be required before a buyer's agent can begin touring properties with that buyer. So that's going to push the commission paid to a buyer's agent to the forefront, and not to be dealt with by the seller, but more directly dealt with by the buyer's agent representing the buyer. They're going to have to sit down and execute a buyer broker agreement where the buyer's agent's going to have to negotiate with the buyer what they want to get paid for their services. And that's part of the transparency issue, to get that in the forefront in the buyer's mind, to let them know that if they're going to retain a particular agent as their representative in searching for a home and negotiating a purchase, they're going to now be aware of what that buyer's agent is expecting to get paid, and that potentially it's going to have to be paid by the buyer, not necessarily by the seller. And so, again, as I've covered in the previous bullet point, this will now eliminate an agent representing a buyer without a written agreement. So that is considered a good thing. And in that respect, the compensation identified, and this is true both with the listing agent negotiating their commission with the seller in the listing agreement, but the buyer's agent negotiating their commission with the buyer in the buyer broker agreement, the compensation amount must be specific. It can't be verbiage such as, a dollar amount or a percentage amount up to, or an approximate amount. It has to be specific. And what's interesting about this new rule is it's also been established that the buyer doesn't have to hire a real estate broker to help them find a home. They can choose someone else. I've read one article that suggested, well, you don't have to get an agent. If you're a buyer and you want help in finding a home and negotiating a purchase, you don't have to get a real estate agent. You can use somebody else, like an attorney. And in that article, it talked about how, well, yeah, now you can, get an attorney to represent you instead of a real estate agent, so that instead of the real estate agent making $50,000 on a commission on a particular, price level, now you can have an attorney represent you for $1,500. Well, I'm not aware of many attorneys who would probably be willing to negotiate a real estate transaction and represent a buyer for just $1,500. So I think that's a little bit exaggerated. But the overall point is the expectation that, maybe don't hire an agent as a buyer's representative, hire an appraiser. Heck, you could hire somebody like me to represent you to purchase a home. And again, you'd have to do that by executing a buyer broker agreement with the individual you're asking to be representing you, and then also negotiate the specific commission that you're going to be potentially having to cover. One of the other issues related to this settlement and why it's happened is to avoid or eliminate a practice that was actually pretty common. And that is, up until this settlement, it's been the case, as I alluded to earlier, when you look at a listing or an agent looks at a listing when they're representing a buyer, that listing would have a field on it that would indicate the amount of compensation, and it's usually in a dollar amount or a percentage amount, that the listing agent, or actually the seller, is going to offer to the buyer's agent. And that portion, or that field in the MLS listing agreements, or I'm sorry, the MLS listings themselves, it's going to be eliminated. Now, why would that be? The idea, again, is when this rule settlement is fully implemented, the MLS listing is no longer going to have a field indicating what the seller is willing to offer to the buyer's agent on a commission. It's going to be gone. Why was this done? Well, it turned out it was done, or being done, for a very good reason that's really just not been focused on for quite a long time. And that is, real estate agents, if they saw listings where the amount offered to a buyer's agent was considered too low, like 2% or 1.5% or 1%, there was determined that there was a practice where real estate agents would simply eliminate or exclude those listings for their search of homes that they want to show to their prospective buyer. The idea being that a real estate agent, a buyer's agent, would decide not to show certain property to a buyer simply because the commission amount being offered by the listing side, by the seller, was deemed too low. So they would just not show them the property. That was considered an abuse of the existing system. And part of this settlement, in fact, a big part of this settlement, was focused on eliminating that ability to exclude listings simply because you, as a buyer's agent, you didn't think the seller was offering you enough commission for your services to your buyer. So that's an important item that's now being eliminated from an MLS listing. Now, what's going to happen in replace of that? The talk is there's going to be a concession field added to it, to the MLS listing. Now, the concession field is not the same as a buyer's agent compensation field. Instead, the concession field is going to be a field where the listing agent and their seller, if they so choose, can decide to input in this field that they're willing to consider, and key is willing to consider, a concession in either a dollar amount or a percentage. Now, the idea here is this would replace the previous compensation offer field with this new concession field. The idea being it would be a way for a seller and their listing agent to signal to prospective buyers and their buyer's agents how much the seller may be willing to provide in a concession to cover what the buyer may have to pay to their buyer's agent per their broker-buyer agreement. So let's say if I'm a buyer's agent and I've negotiated or executed a buyer-broker agreement with my prospective buyer, and I've got my buyer to agree to pay 2.5% commission for my services as a buyer's agent, well, this concession field will be a signal to buyer's agents and their buyers that certain sellers may be willing to consider providing a concession to offset all or maybe a portion of that buyer agent commission that's reflected in the buyer's broker agreement. So that's the change that's going to be made. Again, the whole idea here is to make the commissions more transparent and to get a written agreement in place with the buyer and their agent, in addition to the written agreement that's already done most often or all the time between a listing agent and the seller versus their, with their listing agreement. Now, there's a couple of areas where these changes could have some pretty important implications and effect. One is lender concession limits. We've talked in this program before. There are concession limits that all the mortgage agencies have for different loan programs, for conventional conforming loans, Fannie Freddie loans. The concession limit from an interested party, and that, of course, most often is the seller, is limited based on your down payment size. If you're putting less than 10% down, it's only 3%. If you're putting 10% down up to 25%, it's 6%. And then 25% or down, 25% down or more, it's 9%. FHA, it is 6%. VA, it's only 4%. Well, here's the potential problem, especially if we're going to have this concession field added on an MLS listing. If the concession being offered by the seller is going to cover the buyer agent commission per the buyer broker agreement, will that concession type be considered part of the interested party concession or contributions that would be subject to the limits? That could be a problematic situation, particularly if you're a first-time home buyer, you're putting less than 10% down. Let's say you're putting 3% down. Well, and let's say your buyer's agent that's representing you wants a 2.5% commission. And even if the seller is willing in their concession field, willing to consider offer of 2.5%, if that is deemed to be a seller concession as part of the interested party contribution limits. Well, the problem with that is it eliminates the ability, it uses up in the case of a conventional buyer with 3% down, 2.5 of the 3% concession limit is used up by the commission. So if that buyer is having trouble for their cash to close and would like a seller concession to help cover some of their closing costs, well, that concession limit of 3% is going to be undermined if that 2.5% commission that the buyer agent wants and that the seller agent is willing to, or seller is willing to provide as a concession, it'll use up most of that. And so there's no money left to help the buyer with their other closing costs. So this could really drastically affect how much more cash a buyer in a minimum down payment situation will have to come up with potentially to complete a transaction. Now, my early sense is, and I'm already seeing evidence of, I think what's going to happen with FHA, with VA, with Fannie Freddie, I'm predicting that any commissions that end up being paid by a seller as part of the negotiation in this new format will be excluded from the interested party contribution limits, thereby not diminishing those limits when they're going to be used by a buyer either to help cover their closing costs, pay for a rate buy down or a temporary rate buy down, and so forth. So I think that's going to be the most likely outcome is to exclude seller concessions that are applied specifically to buyer's agent commissions per the buyer broker agreement. I am predicting that those amounts will be excluded from the interested party contribution limits in order to maintain a sort of a level playing field and a more fair situation for home buyers who are getting financing, particularly with a minimum down payment. And then the one other issue that I want to touch on that's going to be a little bit problematic is dual agency. If you think about it, a buyer may decide, well, gee whiz, I don't want to hire a real estate agent to represent me as a buyer's agent, especially if I have to sign an agreement where I'm going to have to agree to pay 2.5–3% to that buyer's agent without knowing for sure the seller might be willing to give me a concession to offset that. So I'll just bypass getting a buyer, an agent for me as a buyer's agent, and I'll just go straight to the listing agent and try to negotiate my purchase with the listing agent. And that way I don't have to, commit to a commission amount that I, as the buyer, might have to pay. Well, that's problematic, particularly in California. California Association of Realtors is already on record. They frown upon dual agency situations. It's not specifically outlawed or prohibited yet, but this new landscape, this new environment, and these rule changes could create some, incentive for buyers to just bypass using a buyer's agent at all and go directly to the listing agent. So we're going to have to see how that plays out, because again, it's going to create, potentially an outcome that is already frowned upon. It's really not, something that's considered a good thing to do, a dual agency situation, because an agent in that situation has got a little bit of a dilemma in terms of who are they really representing. It's hard. You can't really represent and have a fiduciary duty to the seller while at the same time representing the buyer. That, again, is problematic. So that is one area of these new rule changes that I think is going to be subject to more focus and potentially some new changes, those of which we do not know yet. So just be aware, those are the two areas I think that are going to be most problematic with this new environment, with this settlement and the new rule changes. I think overall, eventually, it's going to work itself out. It's just simply going to mean, again, commissions are going to be more transparent, are going to be more specifically negotiated upfront by both the seller and their agent, the buyer and their agent, if they have their own agent. And I think ultimately that's going to be a good thing. So that's where we're at on the settlement, the kind of things that we're going to see coming. So hopefully that'll help you be more informed if you're looking to get into the real estate market now to buy a home. Just be aware of these changes. I think ultimately this is not the end of the world, and I think we're ultimately going to be okay. And this will, work itself out, and we'll still have a pretty good, efficient market. Will there be some improvement or diminishing of real estate commissions? Possibly. And to that extent, certainly it'll help both buyers and sellers. So we'll just have to see to what extent that actually happens. So there you have it. Those are my comments on the settlement agreement for buyers and sellers, what it means. So if you have any, follow-up questions or need more information on that, feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll be happy to discuss any specific scenarios that you have in mind.